She pretended to date another man to make him jealous, but the Korean Mafia boss finally lost control. 1:13 a.m. The rain did not fall gently in Manhattan that night. It came down in long silver needles, cold and indifferent, turning the street outside the Alara Hotel into a black mirror reflecting nothing clean. Naomi Cole stood in the middle of it, not moving. Her dress, midnight blue silk that had cost more than her first month's rent, was already soaked through. The light from the hotel entrance caught her cheekbones like carved obsidian, while her natural hair flattened against her temples. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing you noticed. She was not crying, even though her left wrist hung at an angle that suggested pain. The second thing you noticed was the man in front of her. Kang Min-Jae stood without a coat in the rain like the weather was a personal problem he'd decided to ignore. He was 34 years old, lean and still in how predators are still. Not calm, but suspended. The kind of stillness that precedes movement you won't see coming. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there, climbing from his right wrist to the base of his jaw, winding up the full length of his forearm, coiling over his shoulder, branching across his collarbone, was the tattoo. A massive black serpent rendered in fine Korean ink, its scales precise as calligraphy, its open mouth resting just beneath his jaw. In candlelight, it looked alive. In rain, with water running down his skin, it looked like it was breathing. He was not looking at Naomi. He was looking past her, at the man on his knees behind her on the wet pavement. Ethan Blake. Handsome, wealthy, terrified Ethan Blake, who had never in 32 years of an easy, open, sunlit life understood that some rooms have floors you cannot see until you fall through them. He understood it now. The four men standing behind Min-Jae in the rain, perfectly still, perfectly expressionless. These men were not ordinary bodyguards. You could see in the way they held their hands, in the way they watched Ethan, the way you watch something that is already decided. Min-Jae speaks. You touched her after she said no. 7 words. No raised voice. No performance. The kind of statement that doesn't need volume because it has already decided its own outcome. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. The rain collected in his lashes. Ethan, it wasn't like that. I swear. She was upset and I was just trying to— Min-Jae, I know what you were trying to do. That was all. Min-Jae turned from Ethan then, the way a man turns away from something already resolved, and he looked at Naomi for the first time since he'd stepped out of that black car. And something happened in his face that the rain couldn't wash away. His jaw worked once. His hands, those controlled, precise hands, were shaking. He shrugged off his coat without looking away from her. He stepped forward, and he placed it around her shoulders with hands that could not fully stop trembling. That contradiction broke something open in the air between them. Terrifying violence, unbearable tenderness, all in the same hands. Naomi realized something, then, that she had been carefully not realizing for 14 months. Kang Min-Jae had finally stopped pretending to be civilized, but only halfway. The violence was real. The hands around her shoulders were also real. And that combination was more frightening than either one alone. Naomi, barely above a whisper, Min-Jae, don't. Not yet. He adjusted the coat over her shoulders. His fingertips brushed the bruised wrist. He went very still when he felt it. Then he looked back at Ethan. And the rain kept falling. And the four men behind him hadn't moved. This is where the story actually begins. If this already has your heart racing, you're exactly where you should be. Drop a reaction below and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's go back to where it all truly started. 14 months before the rain. Naomi Cole did not stumble into Min-Jae's world. She walked in through the front door, professionally dressed, carrying a leather-bound interpretation portfolio, fluent in a language most people assumed she couldn't possibly know. That was always the first test. The client would say something in Korean, sharp, dismissive, meant to establish hierarchy, and Naomi would respond in kind, clean formal Korean, completely unimpressed. It reset the room every time. She had started as an independent interpreter for elite Korean business clients 18 months ago, after spending 4 years in Seoul for graduate work. She spoke the language the way people speak things that have cost them something, carefully, precisely, without showing how hard she'd worked for it. The morning she first met Kang Min-Jae, he was in a corner suite at the Langham Hotel in Midtown, conducting a meeting with 3 investment bankers who thought they were negotiating with a luxury hospitality developer. He was impeccably dressed in charcoal gray. The serpent tattoo was visible above his collar, climbing toward his jaw, and the bankers kept stealing glances at it the way people glance at something that disturbs them, and they can't explain why. Naomi walked in, set down her portfolio, and sat across from the group without waiting to be gestured toward a seat. One of the bankers, a man named Cho, leaned over to Min-Jae and said in rapid Korean, clearly assuming the American woman couldn't follow, "Cho, in Korean, she's attractive. Did you hire her for translation or decoration?" The room had not gone quiet yet. Naomi had not reacted yet. She let the silence build for exactly 3 seconds, then looked at Cho with an expression that could have been boredom if boredom had teeth. Naomi, in Korean, perfect and calm, both apparently. And for your sake, I'd suggest the translation matters more right now. Cho in the color of old paper. The other bankers looked at their hands. Min-Jae, for the first time, looked at her, really looked, and something passed across his face that he closed away before it could be named. Not amusement. Something quieter than amusement. Something closer to recognition. He said nothing about it. He never said anything about it. But he requested her by name for every engagement after that. 14 months is a long time to be around someone without touching them. Long enough for the silence to develop its own grammar. Naomi learned to read his silences the way she learned languages. Through immersion, through repetition, through the moments when something meant one thing on the surface and another thing entirely underneath. He never complimented her directly. He never found reasons to stand close. He maintained the precise professional distance of a man committed to self-control, and Naomi respected it, professionally, and found it quietly maddening, personally, in the deep night hours she would never admit to. But there were details. Small, cumulative, devastating details. 3 months in, she had offhandedly mentioned during a break, to no one in particular, that she couldn't find a decent bowl of Audrey-flavored soup anywhere in Manhattan. The following Friday, a takeout bag appeared on her desk from a new Nigerian-Korean fusion place in Koreatown that wasn't listed on any delivery app. There was no name on the receipt. She didn't ask. 5 months in, she had a stalker. A former client who'd become fixated on her, who'd shown up twice near her apartment building. She filed a police report and mentioned it once, in passing conversation with an assistant at the firm. 3 days later, the man disappeared from her vicinity entirely. Not dramatically. He simply stopped appearing. Weeks later, she learned, through a paralegal friend, that the man had received a professional and legal letter warning him of surveillance and litigation. The letter had come from a law firm she'd never heard of. She didn't look into it. 7 months in, a client named Park had drunkenly insulted her during a late dinner meeting, switching to Korean slang he thought she wouldn't catch, reducing her to an object, reducing her work to performance. Naomi had maintained her composure because she was professional, because she was composed, because she had trained herself not to react. But she felt it, the way you feel a slap, even when you don't flinch. Park was no longer a client by the following week. The official reason was a contract dispute. Naomi didn't ask questions. She understood, for the first time, the architecture of Min-Jae's care. He built walls she didn't know were there until the wind stopped reaching her. He had been in love with her the entire time. The audience already suspects it. Naomi is the last to understand it. The problem with this kind of love, silent, controlled, expressed only in the negative space of what isn't said, is that it gives the other person nothing to hold. Naomi had been betrayed 3 years ago by a man who said everything and meant none of it. Her former fiancé had been warm and demonstrative and utterly hollow, and when his other life surfaced, she had spent 6 months putting herself back together piece by piece. She didn't rebuild herself into someone who would wait for silence to reveal itself. She rebuilt herself into someone who moved. So when Ethan Blake walked into a midtown conference room in September and smiled at her with his whole face, the way people smile when they have nothing to hide, because they genuinely don't, she noticed. When he asked her to coffee after a meeting and actually showed up on time and asked her questions and listened to the answers without checking his phone, she noticed that too. When he texted her the next morning with a restaurant recommendation that matched something she'd said in passing, She understood that some men pay attention because they actually want to know you. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was warmth. And Naomi had been cold a long time. The gala was at the Mandarin Oriental. It was a charity event for arts funding, black tie, terrifying floral arrangements, champagne that tasted like consequence. Min-Jae was there for business reasons that were only partly about charity. Naomi was there as Ethan's guest. She wore something the color of deep water. Not trying to be noticed, just existing the way some women exist in rooms, which is to say completely. She and Ethan moved through the crowd with the easy rhythm of two people not yet in love, but actively enjoying the possibility of it. He made her laugh twice. Real laughs. The kind that surprised her. At one point, she touched his arm without thinking about it. Just the lightest contact, a laugh reflex, a human moment. Across the ballroom, Kang Min-Jae was in conversation with a shipping executive. The serpent tattoo was half visible above his collar, the only thing in the room that didn't look hired or curated. He saw Naomi touch Ethan's arm. He didn't react. Not visibly. The whiskey glass in his hand, crystal, heavy, expensive, compressed under pressure until the stem cracked. Not shattered. Not dropped. Just compressed. Past the point glass is meant to go. He felt the edge open the meat of his palm before he felt the pain. He set what remained of the glass on the tray of a passing server without looking at it. Blood dripped once onto the white tablecloth. He continued the conversation with the shipping executive. His face never changed. No dialogue. No announcement. Just blood dripping silently onto white linen. And a man who had finally, after 14 months, reached the limit of something he hadn't acknowledged he had a limit to. Naomi didn't see it. She wouldn't know about it for weeks. October came in cold. Naomi started spending more time with Ethan. Not out of deep feeling, but out of something harder to name. The desire for uncomplicated warmth. The relief of someone who spoke plainly. She wasn't performing happiness, but she was performing the attempt at it. And sometimes the performance becomes the thing. Min-Jae became colder. Not visibly. He was always controlled in professional settings, but in the small calibrations that Naomi had learned to read over 14 months. He answered her questions with fewer words. He stopped making the small decisions that had always protected her without announcing themselves. Once, when she dropped her pen during a meeting and he would normally have retrieved it before she reached for it. That small, automatic courtesy. He did not move at all. He sat still and watched her pick it up herself. That moment disturbed her more than it should have. She spent the cab ride home, turning it over in her mind. What did it mean that she noticed? What did it mean that it hurt? She pushed the question down. She was good at that. The truth about Min-Jae's world revealed itself, not in a single moment, but in accumulation. The way a fog reveals a landscape, slowly, incompletely, the shapes becoming certain only when it's too late to pretend you haven't seen them. She had always known he was wealthy in the particular way of men who don't need to display it. She had always known his business interests were complex in ways she didn't fully understand. She was an interpreter. Her job was language, not ledgers. She translated what was said in rooms, not what the rooms were for. But in late October, she was at his offices waiting for a meeting to conclude, sitting in a side corridor with her phone and a cup of tea, and a door didn't close all the way. She heard voices. She heard specific words. Laundering. Account structures. A name she recognized from news. A name associated with investigations. She didn't move. She sat with the tea going cold in her hands and let the information arrange itself into a shape she couldn't unknow. Then the door opened fully, and she saw Min-Jae in the room with two men she hadn't seen before. One of the men had clearly been injured. Recently, badly. He was kneeling on the floor not because he'd chosen to, but because he couldn't stand fully upright. Min-Jae was standing, and he was speaking in a voice she had never heard from him. Not raised. Not angry. Calm in the way that absolute authority is calm. The tone of a man who doesn't need volume, because consequences happen at his direction regardless. Min-Jae, in Korean, very quiet. You made a decision that cost this organization $4 million in the name of a protected contact. I'm not interested in why. I'm interested in the correction. Understood. The kneeling man understood. You could see it in the architecture of his body, the total collapse of any remaining resistance. Min-Jae turned. He saw Naomi through the open door. Something moved through his face, not guilt exactly, Something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, of an inevitability he'd been outrunning. He closed the door quietly. She heard the lock. She sat in that corridor for another 3 minutes. Then she gathered her things and left. Now the audience is asking a different question. Not, will she love him? But, can she survive loving him? She didn't call him that evening. She didn't mention it at their next meeting. She performed normalcy with the precision of someone who has realized that showing fear in certain rooms is a different kind of danger. But something had shifted. The warmth she'd been cautiously rebuilding toward him. The part of her that cataloged his quiet care, that turned over his silences looking for meaning. It wasn't gone. It had become complicated in the way that real feelings complicate themselves when reality interrupts. She spent more time with Ethan. This was not entirely innocent. Chairman CEO arrived in November like a cold front. He was 71 years old, silver-haired, and carried the particular authority of a man who had survived long enough in dangerous rooms to believe his survival was evidence of his righteousness. He wore traditional clothing at formal occasions not out of cultural reverence, but as a signal. I'm old money, old power, old rules. He and Min-Jae met in a private dining room at a Koreatown restaurant that was never listed in any guide. Naomi was not present. She learned about this meeting later, in fragments, from a conversation she was never supposed to hear. CO had looked at Min-Jae over his tea and said, with the directness of a man who considers courtesy a waste of his time, Chairman CO, you are becoming sentimental. I have watched you for 2 years, and you have never been sentimental. Now you're distracted. A man like you cannot afford soft spots. Soft spots become entry points. Min-Jae, my operational performance has not changed. CO, not yet. I am speaking of the trajectory. There is a woman. The interpreter. She is becoming a liability. Min-Jae set his teacup down. He did not look at CO. He looked at the middle distance in the way of a man who is having a different conversation with himself than the one being spoken aloud. Min-Jae, she is an employee. The situation is managed. CO, I have watched you bleed through a glass of the Mandarin Oriental benefit. Managed is not the word I would use. Min-Jae said nothing. CO finished his tea. CO, standing, adjusting his jacket. A man like you cannot afford to love someone. Remember that the next time she touches another man's arm, and you destroy expensive glassware. He left without looking back. Min-Jae sat alone in the private room for a long time. The restaurant was quiet. Outside, Manhattan continued its oblivious machinery. He put his hands flat on the table. The right one had a healing scar across the palm from the gala. He looked at it the way you look at evidence. We're at the midpoint, and nothing has broken open yet. But it's about to. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that like button right now and drop a comment. Team Naomi or Team Min-Jae. Let's see where this audience stands before the storm hit. The Harlow Gallery held its annual charity art auction on the second Friday in November. It was the kind of event designed to make wealthy people feel cultured while redistributing moderate amounts of money toward education nonprofits. The art was good. The attendance was better. Ethan had been a donor for 3 years and had brought Naomi as his guest. She looked beautiful. She always looked beautiful, but that evening there was something different in the quality of it. Less guarded. She'd spent the previous week sitting with what she'd witnessed through that half-open door, processing it, filing it, arriving not at resolution, but at a fragile decision to stop letting fear make her choices. She laughed genuinely twice on the way there in the car. Ethan noticed and said nothing, just drove and smiled to himself. Min-Jae arrived 40 minutes after they did. He hadn't been on the guest list when Naomi checked it 3 days prior. This registered in her body before her brain processed it, a sudden sharpening of awareness, the way the air changes before weather arrives. He came through the gallery entrance in a black suit, no tie, the tattoo visible above the collar as always, a man who moved through rooms like he had already decided how they would end. He was accompanied by 2 men and a woman Naomi recognized as a gallery board member. He did not look for her. He didn't need to. She understood, from 14 months of watching him navigate rooms, that he already knew exactly where she was. The evening continued. The auction happened. Naomi bid on nothing and clapped for everything and drank 2 glasses of Burlo and worked very hard at existing only in the conversation directly in front of her. Ethan was warm and attentive and completely blissfully unaware of the pressure system building in the room around him. At 9:47 p.m., near the back of the gallery where a large abstract canvas in red and black had drawn a quiet crowd, Ethan turned to Naomi and said something that made her laugh. A genuine, surprised laugh. And then he leaned in and kissed her. Not deeply. The lightest possible contact. A kiss that was more question than statement. The kind that exists in the space between what two people are and what they might become. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Across the gallery, Kang Min-Jae turned and walked out. Not dramatically. Not with visible reaction. He simply was there, and then he was not there, and the door to the gallery closed behind him without a sound. The absence was more devastating than any visible reaction could have been. Rage breaks. Cold departures are the sound of something closing forever. Naomi felt at the moment it happened. She felt him leave the room the way you feel a fire go out. The warmth you didn't know you were facing. Ethan didn't notice. He was still looking at her, checking her expression for clues, navigating the honest uncertainty of someone who doesn't play games. She smiled at him. She meant it. And it also wasn't enough. And both those things were true at the same time in the complicated way true things often are. She told herself the sickness in her stomach was the wine. The call came at 2:16 in the morning. Ethan's assistant. Ethan was at Lenox Hill. He'd been attacked leaving his parking garage on 63rd Street 2 hours after the gallery. 3 men masked. He was conscious. He had a fractured radius and 4 broken ribs and a laceration along his jawline that required 12 stitches. He was not dead. This appeared to have been intentional. The injuries were severe without crossing the line that cannot be uncrossed. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time after the call. Then she got dressed and got into a car. Not toward Lenox Hill. Toward the Alara Hotel, where Min-Jae kept the penthouse when he was in New York. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse foyer. She'd been there 3 times professionally. She had never arrived uninvited. At 3 in the morning, with her hands shaking and her jaw set the way it sets when she has decided to be honest about something at personal cost. Min-Jae opened the door before she knocked. He was still dressed. Black shirt, dark trousers, as if he hadn't been anywhere near sleep. The serpent tattoo rose from his forearm, visible where his cuffs were rolled back, the ink dark against his skin like a permanent signature of everything he was. He looked at her face and went very still. Naomi, Ethan is in the hospital. Min-Jae stepped back from the door, not away from the accusation, just creating space for her to enter or not enter, leaving her choice. She walked in. The penthouse was quiet and dark except for the city light through floor-to-ceiling glass. Manhattan spread itself below them like a circuit board, alive with its own indifferent electricity. She stood in the center of the main room with her arms at her sides and her chin up because she needed some part of her to be upright, even when the rest of her was fracturing. Naomi, you don't get to destroy people because you're angry. Min-Jae was standing near the window. He didn't turn around immediately. She watched his shoulders rise once, slowly, and fall. Naomi, voice starting to break, refusing to let it. You don't get to do that. You don't get to sit in your silence for 14 months, and then, because I had the audacity to let someone else be kind to me, you don't get to make him bleed for it. You don't have that right. You never said. Her voice stopped. Started again. You never said anything. He turned around, and the thing she was not prepared for was his face. Not cold. Not controlled. Not the composed, terrifying stillness she'd learned to read as a language over more than a year. He looked like something had been stripped away, like the glass had cracked, and what was underneath it was not monstrous. It was just unbearable. Just a man who had been holding something too heavy for too long. He finally breaks. 14 months of restraint, Min-Jae. I have spent 14 months trying not to become the worst thing in your life. The room breathed that in. Naomi stood very still. Min-Jae, continuing, quieter now, like the words are costing him. I know what I am. I know what this world is. I know what it does to people who get close to it. You are the most intelligent person I have worked beside in my life. You're the only person who has made me want to be something other than what I've built myself into. And I have spent every day of 14 months keeping that to myself, because the alternative was pulling you into something you deserve to be completely clear of. He stopped. He looked at the floor, then back at her. Min-Jae, I was not the one who touched him. Silence. Complete, enormous silence, with Manhattan burning quietly behind the glass. Naomi, very carefully, what? Min-Jae, I wanted to. I will not lie to you about that. I stood outside this building tonight, and I wanted to, but I didn't. Someone else made that decision. And I need you to understand. This is going to be much more dangerous than you realize. She didn't go home that night. Not because he asked her to stay. He didn't. He told her, with the directness of someone who had stopped having the energy to manage her perceptions of him, that her apartment might not be safe for the next several days, and that she could take the guest room, or she could take a car to whatever hotel she chose, and he would ensure her security at either location. He said it the way people say things when they're too tired for strategy. She took the guest room. She lay on her back in the dark in a room that smelled like expensive soap and asked the ceiling what she was doing. The ceiling, like most ceilings, provided no assistance. In the morning she found him already awake, standing in the kitchen with his back to her, making coffee. It was 5:47 a.m. The city outside was in that particular gray pre-light that makes Manhattan look almost gentle. The tattoo moved as he moved, the serpent coiling up his forearm as he reached for cups, the scales catching the overhead light and throwing it back in fragments. Naomi, standing in the kitchen doorway, how long were you awake? Min-Jae, not turning around, I wasn't asleep. She looked at the chair positioned near the hallway entrance, at the angle it was facing, at the small, precise logic of its placement. Naomi, you sat outside my room all night. He set 2 cups on the counter. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He poured the coffee. Naomi, quieter, you were guarding the door. Min-Jae, finally turning around, handing her a cup. I was making sure you weren't disturbed. She took the cup. Their fingers didn't touch. They were both very careful about that. She sat at the kitchen island, and he leaned against the counter across from her, and for the next 20 minutes they drank coffee, and he told her, with minimal embellishment, what she was actually in the middle of. Chairman CEO. The financial network. The way CEO viewed her as a vulnerability in Min-Jae that needed to be excised. The attack on Ethan was a message, not to Ethan, who had been entirely incidental to it, to Min-Jae, and, through Min-Jae, to her. Remove her, or have her removed. Naomi, absorbing this with her cup between her hands. So this whole time, the danger wasn't you. Min-Jae, the danger has always partly been me. I'm not going to revise that. But the immediate danger is not me. Naomi, why didn't you tell me about any of this? Who you really were? 14 months ago. He looked at her for a long moment. Min-Jae, because I was hoping I wouldn't need to. I was hoping I could keep these 2 parts of my life from ever touching. Naomi, and then you fell in love with the interpreter. He didn't answer. Which was the answer? The days that followed were the strangest of Naomi's life. She moved through the penthouse learning its rhythms, the hours he worked, the calls he took in languages she cataloged without effort, Korean, Mandarin, a few phrases of Russian, the precise way he organized his environment, the fact that he ate almost nothing before noon and then ate ravenously at lunch and barely again at dinner. She learned that the tattoo, which had always seemed like intimidation, had a different quality up close. It was art. The scales had been drawn individually by a master tattoo artist in Busan, someone who had apparently worked on it over 18 months. She learned this because she asked, and because he answered, which seemed to surprise him slightly. The asking. Naomi, studying the tattoo on his forearm while they sat at the kitchen table at 11 p.m. Why a serpent? Min-Jae looked at it the way you look at a decision you made long ago that you've stopped fully examining. Min-Jae, in Korean mythology, the serpent is not evil. It is the watcher. It lives at the boundary between what is safe and what is not. It protects by knowing both sides. Naomi studied the coil of it across his forearm, the open mouth near his jaw, the eyes rendered in such fine detail they seemed to follow light. Naomi, and which side are you on? He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. Min-Jae, I used to believe I was neither, that I simply existed at the border. A pause. Recently, I have been less certain. The intimacy of 3 a.m. in a kitchen with someone you can't fully claim became its own kind of unbearable. He taught her, in those strange, suspended days, how to identify surveillance vehicles, The way a car parked on the same block across 2 consecutive mornings becomes a pattern. The makes and models more commonly used for professional surveillance. The way a watcher unconsciously adjusts posture when you look directly at them. He taught her not because he wanted to frighten her, but because he said, with characteristic directness, Min-Jae, if anything happens to me, I need you to be able to recognize the shape of danger before it reaches you. Naomi, that's a terrifying sentence. Min-Jae, yes. Naomi, do you do that on purpose? Just confirm the terrifying thing without softening it at all. Min-Jae, the barest suggestion of something that wasn't quite a smile. I was told it's a character flaw. Naomi, by whom? Min-Jae, everyone who has known me long enough. She laughed. He watched her laugh the way you watch something rare and irreplaceable that you know you're going to lose. Chairman CEO came to the penthouse on a Tuesday afternoon. He had not been invited. He arrived with 2 men and a sense of entitlement that had calcified over decades into something indistinguishable from authority. Naomi was in the study when he arrived. She heard the voices from behind the closed door. She understood every word. She sat perfectly still and listened to a 71-year-old man give the person she had been circling for 14 months a choice that had no good sides. Chairman CEO, the board has discussed the situation. It is our collective view that you have allowed a personal entanglement to compromise your judgment, and by extension the security of this organization. We are not asking for your analysis of this conclusion. We are presenting it. Min-Jae, very quiet, I understand. CEO, the woman leaves your life permanently. All professional and personal contact ends. She receives a generous severance and a relocation package if she requires one. She is not harmed, but she is removed. Or, he paused for effect. He had been using pauses as weapons for 50 years. Or you remove yourself from this organization and from its protection. You understand what that means. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Min-Jae, I will give you my answer tomorrow. CEO, standing, you have until noon. He left. The apartment went quiet. Behind the study door, Naomi sat without moving for a very long time. He chose the organization, or appeared to. The following morning, he walked into the study where Naomi was working and stood in the doorway with that particular stillness that she now understood as the stillness of a man who had decided something and was not going to be talked out of it. Min-Jae, I'm going to arrange for you to stay somewhere safe for the next several weeks. There are things I need to resolve. After that, he stopped. After that, I don't know what the landscape looks like, but it won't look like this. Naomi, watching his face, what did you tell CEO? Min-Jae, I told him what he needed to hear. Naomi, that's not an answer. Min-Jae, no. It's the only thing I can give you right now. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had ordered food, she mentioned once. Who had walked her home through hired shadows she never saw. Who had bled through a whiskey glass at a charity gala rather than show her what she cost him. Who had sat outside her door all night on a chair, facing the hallway, just watching. Naomi, you're going to disappear, aren't you? He didn't answer. Which was the answer, again? He was consistent, at least, in that particular cruelty. She picked up her bag. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and didn't look back because she understood, with the precision of a woman who has been paying close attention for 14 months, that if she looked back she would not leave. She left. What Min-Jae did in the weeks that followed was not known to Naomi in real time. She learned it later, in pieces, from sources she could not have anticipated. He did not simply comply with CEO's ultimatum. He did not simply defy it either. He did something more dangerous and more deliberate than either. He had spent 14 months maintaining professional control in the organization's financial structures. In those months, he had also, quietly, systematically, accumulated evidence. Documented irregularities in CEO's personal operations. Money moved outside the organization's sanction channels. Bribes paid to officials whose prosecution could destabilize the entire network. A paper trail built over years that CEO had believed was invisible because he believed himself to be untouchable. Min-Jae spent 3 weeks doing what he did best, working in silence, with precision, at the intersection of what is legal and what is simply true. He contacted 3 specific people within the organization who had their own reasons to want CEO's era to end. He structured a financial maneuver that effectively dismantled CO's independent revenue streams without triggering the kind of immediate response that ends embodies. It was not clean. Nothing in that world is fully clean. It cost him relationships he had maintained for a decade. It cost him the protection of the organization's formal structure, which meant he was operating for several weeks without a net. Chairman CO understood, eventually, that the floor had been removed from beneath him, that the man he'd underestimated as a sentimental had in fact been the most disciplined operator in the room the entire time. Disciplined enough to wait, to build, to act at exactly the right moment with exactly the right evidence. CO was removed from his position by the organization's own governance structure, which he had believed was permanently his instrument. He had, for years, failed to account for the possibility that Min-Jae might one day turn his own methodology against him. The internal war was not theatrical. It was quiet and devastating and conducted in meeting rooms and on encrypted lines and through the movement of numbers that most people cannot read as violence. But Min-Jae did not emerge from it unharmed. The physical cost came from the 2 weeks of vulnerability during which CO's allies still had operational capacity. There was an incident in a parking structure in Queens that Naomi would learn of only afterward, described to her in terms deliberately stripped of their worst details by a man who did not want her to carry that imagery. She found him through a number she didn't know she had. A text message from an unknown phone with an address in Inwood, the quiet northern tip of Manhattan, where the city stops performing itself and becomes simply residential, bordering the park. An address and a time and nothing else. The building was unremarkable. The apartment on the 3rd floor was small and clean and contained almost nothing. A bed, a table, a chair, the kind of minimal furnishing that speaks not of poverty, but of temporary occupation. A safe house, she understood, in the vocabulary she had been involuntarily learning. He was sitting in the chair when she arrived. He stood when the door opened, and she had a single moment of adjustment, of processing what she was looking at. He was thinner. There was a healing wound at his hairline, and the way he held one shoulder told her something had happened there that had not yet fully resolved. He was wearing a plain gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the serpent tattoo was fully visible, all the way up his forearm and over his shoulder. The ink as precise and permanent as ever in contrast to the exhaustion in the rest of him. The two of them stood in the small room looking at each other across the distance between the door and the chair. The city outside was muffled. It was late afternoon, and the light was that particular winter gold that makes everything look like it's being carefully preserved. Naomi set her bag down. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the table, so she was closer to eye level with him. She looked at the wound at his hairline without reaching for it. Naomi, how bad was it? Min-Jae, manageable. Naomi, that's not the same as fine. Min-Jae, no. A breath. The gold light moved across the floor. Naomi, is it over? Min-Jae, CO is finished. The specific threat to you is gone. The larger world I come from. His jaw tightened once. That doesn't simply stop existing. I am not going to tell you otherwise. She nodded. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. Naomi, you chose me. Over the organization. Min-Jae, I chose what I chose. I'm not going to romanticize it for you. I destroyed something I built for 12 years. Not all of it was indefensible. Not all of it was, he stopped. Started again. Some of what I am is not something I can make clean. I need you to hold that without me softening it. Naomi, I know what you are. Min-Jae, quietly, do you? Naomi, I've been paying attention for 14 months. I know what you are. He looked at her for a long time. The exhaustion in him was not performance. It was the genuine depletion of a man who had been holding too many things at once for too long and had finally set most of them down. The line that should destroy you, Min-Jae. Barely above a whisper. I try to become someone you could survive loving. The room absorbed it. The gold light held. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked at this man, at the serpent coiled permanently into his skin, at the scar at his hairline still learning how to heal, at the hands that had shaken when they placed a coat around her shoulders in the rain. At the eyes of someone who had spent 14 months deciding she was worth more than what he was, and then spent 3 weeks proving it at personal cost he would not fully describe to her. She didn't look away from any of it. Let us return, now, to the rain. To Naomi standing outside the Alara Hotel with a bruised wrist and a soaked dress, Min-Jae's coat around her shoulders still radiating his warmth. To Ethan Blake, on his knees on the wet pavement, finally, fully understanding that the world contains rooms he was never meant to enter. To the four men behind Min-Jae, who had not moved. To the serpent tattoo, dark against Min-Jae's skin in the streetlight, water running along every scale. What had happened was this. Ethan, who had genuinely liked Naomi and had genuinely meant no harm, and who was not a bad man, but was a dangerously uncomplicated one, had had too much to drink at a dinner that had gone long, and had found Naomi walking to her car alone, and had misread the moment in the way that men with no experience of being truly dangerous sometimes misread moments. He had reached for her. She had said no, clearly, physically, without ambiguity. He had reached. Again. That was when the black car had appeared. Min-Jae had not touched Ethan. He had simply appeared, with the four men, in the rain, at 1:13 in the morning, and said 5 words. You touched her after she said no. And then he had turned to Naomi, and his hands had been shaking, and he had placed his coat around her shoulders with those shaking hands, and that was the contradiction she could not organize into something safe. The violence available to him and the care available to him, existing in the same body, in the same moment, turned entirely toward her protection. Min-Jae, to his men, not looking away from Naomi. Make sure he gets a car home. That was all. Ethan was placed in a cab by men who scared him profoundly and driven home, and never sought out again. He would later tell people, haltingly, that he'd had a strange evening in New York that he didn't fully understand. He was right about that. Naomi, in the rain, with the coat around her, looked at Min-Jae. Her wrist hurt. Her dress was ruined. Her hair was flat against her face, and she was standing in a puddle, and she understood, in that moment, completely unafraid. Not because he was safe. He was not safe, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But because she had been afraid of the wrong thing for 14 months. She had been afraid of the silence, of what it meant that he wouldn't speak. She had been afraid of his world and his past, and the permanent serpent on his skin and the things she'd heard through half-open doors. All of that was real. None of it had gone away. It never would. But in the rain, at 1:13 a.m., with his coat around her shoulders and his hands still slightly trembling in Manhattan, doing nothing in particular behind them, she understood that fear had been doing her thinking for her for too long. Hers and his. Back in the safe house in Inwood, in the gold light of the late afternoon, Naomi looked at Min-Jae and understood that she was standing at an edge. Not a dramatic one, not the edge of a cliff, or a ballroom, or a confrontation. Just the quiet edge that appears in ordinary rooms between ordinary hours when a decision has to be made about what kind of life you are willing to build. Min-Jae sat very still. He was looking at her with the expression she had first seen in that Langham Hotel conference room 18 months ago, when she had answered Cho in clean, perfect Korean and surprised him into something he didn't know he felt yet. The same expression. All that time accumulated behind it now. Min-Jae, slowly, like the words cost him something irreplaceable. If staying with me ruins your life. He stopped. Began again. Min-Jae, if staying with me ruins your life, would you still choose it? The room held its breath. The light held. Manhattan, muffled and vast outside the window, continued its indifferent machinery. Naomi looked at this man, the serpent permanent in his skin, the scar still learning to heal, the dark eyes of someone who had been sitting at the border between danger and protection for so long he had almost forgotten what solid ground felt like. A man who had ordered food she mentioned once, who had walked her home through shadows, who had bled in silence at a gala because the sight of her laughing in someone else's company was too much for his control to fully contain, who had spent 3 weeks dismantling an empire at personal cost rather than let her become someone's leverage, who had said, in exhaustion and without performance, I try to become someone you could survive loving. She didn't answer with words. She reached across the small distance between them, and she took his hand. I try to become someone you could survive loving. Kang Min-Jae, did she make the right choice? Can someone like Min-Jae ever truly change? Or does the serpent always remain what it is? Should Naomi have walked away when she had the chance? Drop your verdict in the comments. Subscribe for the next story. Like if this destroyed you, even a little. We read every single comment. Everyone,